So our next speaker is Captain Alan Gray. He's the president and CEO of the Port of Halifax with a 20-year career at sea, during which period he sailed all over the world and traded on various vessels from ro-ro to container and bulk through the last 10 years, which were spent on LPG tankers with Bergensons of Norway. He has worked in a variety of senior positions within the maritime sector, including managing vessel traffic services, operational management of shipping, and Harbour Master and General Manager of Port Operations in Fremantle, Australia. Captain Gray was Federal Master of the Company of Master Mariners Australia and held the position of President of the International Harbour Masters Association before joining Port of Halifax as President and CEO in 2019, just before we locked down. So apologies, Alan Gray, this is the first taste of Canada, but anyway, we'll have that beer soon. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And it arrived just before the lockdown, so they made sure I couldn't go back to Australia and stay here to enjoy the wonderful climate. So my discussion here, and to set some scene before the workshop, is to talk about perhaps what the fundamental roles of ports are, and I see them as four. And interleaved as I go through this, I will highlight some experiences I had in Australia before coming here, where LNG was identified as the first interim fuel, and Australia was the largest exporter of LNG in the world, but the lowest domestic user. And so I was very pleased to hear through the thread of the conversation that on this journey with hydrogen, there is a clear government commitment to make sure there's a large domestic use of the hydrogen. So there's four fundamental roles for the port. One, as you can see, is the export market, and we need to be a facilitator of exports. That's our role. Two is a user, and some people have touched on it and some of the opportunities there, and I'll go into that a bit deeper. The other is to provide and facilitate for bunkering. If it's to be used as a fuel, ports need to consider the bunkering opportunity in that. And the fourth role is a gateway to the green economy. And I'll touch a little bit more on that, but it's some of it's around regulation, but some of it's around being a living lab. So let's start on the first one. Facilitating exports. If hydrogen is going to be a predominant export market, and that there seems to be ample opportunity for that in Atlantic Canada particularly, then ports need to now consider what's the sort of infrastructure that they will require in the port to facilitate that. Now, this needs to be built into our master plans now as to how we're going to move and make infrastructure available for that. Now, in that, we need to really sort of understand what are the storage needs, what are the vessel types that we're going to be receiving, and how are they going to be managed safely. So there's quite a bit of work to be working with industry to understand that demand for export and what are the facilities. But there's some opportunities. Repurposing existing oil facilities that maybe have declined over the years with pricing of oil and a lack of demand. So that transition of infrastructure might be a great opportunity for us as we go forward. But it's a critical path for us is to consider that level of infrastructure that needs an investment. And ports need to be a little bit smarter. We can demand government to provide these things. You know, government, if you want to go down that path and have export facilities for hydrogen, provide some money. But I think there's greater opportunity for us to enter into public-private partnerships and work with the private industry to facilitate the opportunities to develop the infrastructure that's necessary to promote the export of hydrogen. And these could be coupled on the back of hydrogen production, domestic use around the port. So that's the other side of it, is that domestic use. You know, what are the port's opportunities for domestic use? Well, one of them is if we're going to have ships arrive here and we want ships to minimize their carbon footprints within the port, people have often talked about cold ironing, plugging a ship into the in when it gets into port, so they don't use their generators and onboard burning of diesel. And there's some issues around that, because unless you've got a clean power source for them to plug into, then all you're really doing is moving the emissions from one source to another. but it does produce clean air for you as an opportunity for the local community. So hydrogen may well be, by the use of power cells, give us an opportunity to plug in vessels into hydrogen power cells, shore-based ones, that provide them power while they're in port. So therefore, we get a local reduction. Port equipment could move over to hydrogen instead of diesel. So some of our trucks, our onboard equipment, the automated vehicles, the ground vehicles that we're using. And also we could look at small power cells that operate different equipment. Local marine use, tugs have moved, there have been some developments in electric diesel hybrid tugs, and you find that they generally run on electric when they're moving from point to point, but to get the power they need in handling a vessel, they have to move back over to diesel. The calorific value of hydrogen probably allows them to operate those vessels on hydrogen at all times. So that's an opportunity there. The ferry operations in the port, maintenance vessels in the port. So there's a number of opportunities. Bunkering. Now, one of the key challenges, and when you're moving over to these fuels, is if you want the maritime industry to shift, if you want the large deep sea sector to move on these fuels, there has to be the opportunity for them to bunker. And I know we just saw that there are multiple pathways. People are talking about ammonia as a possible source. People are talking about pure hydrogen as a possible source. The danger with the multiple sources is the fact that vessels need to know that if they're going over to a fuel source, that they've got bunkering available anywhere they go. And that's the advantage they currently have with heavy fuel oil, is that they can virtually get it anywhere they go. So if there's multiple sources and ships are operating on multiple different sources of bunkering, it makes it harder both for the shipping industry to adapt, but also it's hard for the port to understand what bunkering suppliers they have to have infrastructure for. So where you can get around that is corridors. And what we saw in Australia with LNG being a major producer in Australia, you could see that on trade routes where there was an LNG corridor, where there was a pathway at both ends, LNG was supplied at both ends, or the round voyage would allow them to get back to an LNG producing port, then the transition to LNG was an easy path. The problem for them, though, was most ships are sold on into ultimate trades, and then you've got the issue of the fact that they've got no trades they can sell those ships into unless there's LNG in there. So it's important that we are providing an extensive hydrogen pathway for bunkering. And then the ports need to consider what are the facilities, safe facility operations in there. Underpinning that is regulations around it. One of the challenges we had when we first started with LNG bunkering in Australia, there were no regulations in Australia. There was nothing available to the ports to say, how are we going to do the safe handling of LNG and the bunkering operations? And to build major infrastructure was quite difficult. It was expensive for the volume of vessels that were operating in LNG. So we considered on going truck bunkering first, moving to vessel, moving to infrastructure. So these are the things that we need to consider. How do we transition across that? The other area is the facilitation, the gateway. And there's a couple of things there. One is the ports can be a living lab. And Port of Halifax recently opened the pier, which is our living lab, which allows access by industry innovators, startup operations, and major companies for that matter, to test bed their opportunities, test bed them in the real environment and see if they can work. And that's a role for the port. We're not just a gateway for trade, we're a gateway for developing the economy and accelerating these networks. Another reason why the Port of Halifax joined the Atlantic Accelerator Network with some of the ports in Europe on the Atlantic coast on how do we accelerate a lot of these green economy issues. So that's a role. The other in facilitating is dealing with the regulation side of things. Far too often with these things, and again, I saw it in Australia with LNG, is the regulation is behind where industry is. And if we're going to adapt quickly, if we're going to stay in this market, if we're going to be a leader in hydrogen, not just to follow but a leader in the hydrogen, we need to be innovative in our regulation, and we need to be very agile in our regulation. If we can't do that, we will be trailing, and industry will be looking to us on how do they get this thing out? How do they get their exports out? How do they use this? How do they store it? So we need to be in front and coming together as a hub, as a group, industry and regulators, and developing the necessary regulation and keeping it innovative and agile, something government's not prone to do. That will be the challenge for us going forward. Thanks.